Good afternoon. No, it's okay. It's okay. Good afternoon. I hope lunch was good. The fish was excellent. We have two panelists, so they're going to talk a lot. The subject of the panel is hurricane-proof banking, protecting against external impacts. We have the first question to Eric. How can we have better banking?
Oh, God. Right after lunch, you asked me that? Okay. Better banking. Listen, this banking issue, as it relates to the CIP, is the most important issue happening in our industry. So before I answer how do we get better banking, we need to understand banking. Banking is a highly regulated environment that's gotten tenfold in terms of regulations since the financial crisis. And there's still a lot of misconceptions around what do the banks need to do? What is it they need to understand about our clients? Source of funds and source of wealth, what does that really mean? And all this also relates to due diligence, and I know the CIUs that we heard earlier this morning, they do a good job understanding a person's background, their history. They check the veracity of the information on the applications that we submit, that industry participants submit. But I think there's still a gap on understanding the source of wealth and source of funds that ultimately come through these programs. And that's where the correspondent banking and the banking industry is raising a bit of a red flag. The American correspondent banking is what really is the foundation to all the funds that go through this region. So how do you make it better? I mean, the banks are going to do what they have to do. We need to understand what it is they need to get those funds flowing a little bit quicker and faster. And I still think, to finish on this point, is that we need to create better communication and sharing information between what the CIU has and what the banks need. And to do that procedurally, maybe a little bit earlier than what's happening right now.
Jackie, how could you say that in your practice in Nevis?
Thank you very much, Sam. When I looked at the topic and I realized it spoke about hurricane proofing, I said to myself, we may not be able to hurricane proof banking, but we may have to get prepared. Maybe hurricane prepared is the best word. And I looked at a few examples and looked at what the reports were saying. And I endorsed the report by the World Bank that spoke about having more consistency and clarity in terms of the regulatory expectations of banks and actually assessing the regulatory framework. This is one of the reasons why we have the risking by the corresponding bank, because there's no consistency, and the corresponding banks are fearful of the cost of compliance. They're fearful of the penalties and fines that would be imposed, and they don't have confidence in the respondent banks and the framework, the regulatory framework that is in place. So in order to improve banking, we have to improve that framework so that we can give the corresponding bank that confidence that we know what we are doing in the Caribbean region.
So how would you suggest or foresee a closer collaboration between the CIUs, the units, and the banks in regard to maybe sharing due diligence, the AML?
It's about understanding the information that is presented. From the CIO perspective, you know what is required with respect to the due diligence of applicants. With respect to the banks, they don't necessarily request the same information as the citizenship by investment unit. I think there should be a consistency, maybe the copy of the same application, the same due diligence documents are given to the bank. And also, with respect to the restricted countries, we would have heard earlier that Antigua has a list of 7 restricted countries. I believe in SINKITs, there are only 3 restricted countries. But when you look at the banks, the list of restricted countries are way more than 7 or 3. So whereas someone from Sudan, for example, may be allowed to apply to SINKITs for citizenship, it was very difficult to get funds from Sudan into the jurisdiction because it's a restricted country on the bank's list. So there should be greater collaboration between the citizenship by investment units and the banks with respect to the restricted countries and with respect to the due diligence documents that are required for both receiving funds as well as processing applications.
Any suggestion, Eric?
Well, I agree 100% with everything you just said. And I think that what the banks are concerned about, that maybe the CIUs have some information, but probably not as deep information as what the banks require, is again the source of funds and source of wealth. People's lives is like a Rubik's Cube. You got not one side, not two sides, you're 6 sides. You could check what's online. You could hire background verification firms to validate the information that's before you. You have risk weighting to get a sense of how risky the client is. But beyond all that, the banks need all that, but they really want to understand what's the source of that money coming in today? What's the source of the client's overall wealth? And there's probably room for a little bit more questioning around that to appease the corresponding banking requirements. And as you say, I mean, I used to work for HSBC. We had the so-called red list, the red countries, and there was a good 17 or 18 of them, and then you had the level 2, you know, not quite red, but let's say yellow, and another 40 of those countries, and so forth. So the CIUs really need to understand what the banking world's about.
Yeah, because especially they have quite a thick 40, 50-page document on the due diligence. If they can maybe give, let's share part of that, sections of that due diligence with the banks, maybe that would make their job easier too.
They would definitely make the bank's job easier. So there should be more effective sharing of information. And the gatekeepers, the attorneys, the authorized persons, I think you should engage discussion with the banks. You're the ones who are providing this information for receiving the funds on behalf of the clients. And so just that sharing and communication discussion with the banks is important. Now, also, I think education is important with respect to within the banking institutions. We've seen instances where they're asking for information for example, witnesses to signatures and information with respect to persons who work within the translation company. And we don't know if it's coming from the respondent or the correspondent bank, but there are a lot of little issues, and we're wondering if this is effective information for the purpose of finding out the source of wealth. And I think we need to have a bit more education across the board with respondent banks, and I think it would definitely help a lot in terms of how we treat transactions.
We know the symptoms of all these banking problems we have, but what's the source? Where does it come from? And who should we talk to?
Well, I think everything went south after the FATF put out its 2012 recommendations, and you look at number 13 with respect to corresponding bank, putting that onus on the corresponding bank to get some information from the respondent bank and be able to assess clients' due diligence and the client's due diligence. The correspondent banks simply said, you know, no, this is too much for us, it's too high risk, it's too costly, and just like that, you had a few shutting up shop, to put it that way. And in addition to that, we saw, for example, Barclays in 2013 close a couple of hundred accounts. They just didn't want to have to deal with the issues. So I think it really came from that. And now we have quite amusingly the FATF and CFATF saying, well, that was not the intention of recommendation number 13. The intention was for you to better manage risk and not de-risk. But I don't know if it's a matter of a little too late, because the banks are not going to easily assume those risks again. That is the difficult part. But I think that was the beginning of what we saw in terms of the de-risking of.
And the liabilities are there. I mean, have you read some of these fines that some of these banks are actually
It's
being
crazy.
imposed? It's big bucks, it's big dollars, and it's scaring many of them, and that's triggered this de-risking, and you gave the Barclays example, and my ex-employer certainly has done a lot of that as well.
We
So
saw like Douche Bank.
Yes.
They were fined $860 million. And we had banks in France, I think
Paribas?
it's DN. Yes. It was $8.9 billion for assisting with matters in Sudan, Iraq, and Cuba. So the banks are not going to easily assume these risks because the fines are huge.
So this brings the question of the central banks. And so with the central banks now looking to undertaking AML review for commercial banks, how does that impact on fund being processed, if any?
I think they have
Or
a
fund
role. I mean,
processing.
the central bank and the politicians have a role to play to explain to the banking counterparts, big bank names that we've just outlined, the nature of the CIP world. It's, there's all these tools now in our industry to really get to the bottom of who we have in front of us and who we're dealing with. So the resources exist, but there's this normal apprehension around the industry that we're in. And there's therefore, as you said earlier, a need for some education. And who's to push that up at those levels, at the correspondent bank? It has to be the central bank and frankly, a few PMs by their side to explain that this is, as Mr. PM Brown said this morning, CIP matters. It's a big deal here in this part of the world. It's important. It ain't going away. The demand for the service and for the privileges that these programs provide is increasing. The world's a precarious place. There are a lot of complicated parts of the world, but the resources exist to get to the bottom and understanding who we have in front of each other. Point number one. Point number two, I made this comment to one or two CIU heads. It's a risky business. I've been doing it for 25 years on the residency and citizenship. It's a risky business. So I don't understand how we don't see double-digit refusals when I know every time out of 10 clients that I meet, there's one or two that probably shouldn't be going through these programs. There's nothing wrong with that. It's 80% of them are actually quite fine. Yeah. But there are good reasons why people require these services and these privileges, but we got to be careful about the ones who are asking and coming to any one of our doors for the wrong reasons. CIUs could have the licensed agents and the industry participants bear some of that risk and liability, and some have taken steps to, I guess, educate the agents who are involved and having to have some subscriptions to these various databases that allows you to, as a practitioner, before you submit, to do some verification. All those are good measures. But in the end, I know by history that, that there's, call it 10 or 20% of the clients that come knocking on our doors for these services that we should not be taking on. Therefore, probability suggests that you probably should be seeing those kind of refusal rates. Some countries are experiencing that. Sam, you and I come from a part of the world where we know with the Quebec Investor Program that's been around for 30 years has been arguably a little bit too aggressive at times in terms of refusal rates. Yes. I mean, crazy numbers like 30, 40%. I think in Malta they're averaging, I'm told, 20%. That feels about right for what we know as applicants from difficult parts of the world that are applying, because it's a risky business. It's a risky business, but there are so many great resources. Many of you actually in the due diligence industry know this better than I. If you really want to know if somebody owns 43% of ABC Inc. in Kazakhstan, you could get that information. And as an example, it gets a little bit more, subjective when you get into source of wealth. But even there, I would say I had this question all the time in my previous role. People would say, well, how much do I give? How much information should I give about that? Most people, whether it's any one of us or Bill Gates or Richard Branson, could summarize the overall net worth that they have into anywhere from 3 to 6 bullets, 3 to 6 major milestones that happened in their life that made them go from A to B to C to D in terms of overall net worth. And it therefore doesn't have to be a 600-page storyline, but we could ask our clients a little bit about, tell me that journey where now you're telling me you're worth 30 million.
Yeah, but in a Quebec case, Quebec immigrant investor case, we really actually go to the first dollar they're earned, and we're capable of actually documenting and describing, narrativing
But that's
how they
overkill.
come to. That's an
overkill.
overshoot, yes. Coming back to the previous question, source, I mean, what causes this? Is there some banks, especially in considering we are dealing mostly in US dollars, is New York. How could you foresee this issue being solved? I mean, unless we change their mind, that's going to be difficult. But is there any legal instruments we can use? Because in a case, when we used to do EB-5 with US, we used to apply for a license from OFAC.
Yes.
They used to actually approve a certain person from a certain sanctioned country or certain area to be able to bring the money to the US and invest it. And the banks would take the money very easily. Do you think maybe that could be something?
That might be a consideration. The OFAC license is usually used with respect to persons who have been blocked from moving monies they would apply before, or for those persons who want to travel into restricted areas, such as Cuba, when it was restricted for some travelers, and so they would apply. So that might be something that we can look at. You can apply for a general license or a specific license through OFAC. Maybe we could have the individual applicants apply for a specific license if they want to move certain funds in US dollars through the US. Or we can have maybe the Caribbean governments coming together and applying for a general license to do this type of business in US currency and move monies through the US. So that too is a very good option, and it may be worth exploring.
Okay, let's move to another aspect. We deal with a lot of high net worth individuals. I mean,
Yes.
these applicants will spend several $100,000. What they won't spend several $100,000, which is equivalent to their life savings. Their savings or the net worth is several times higher. How can we make them invest more here? For example, can we look at asset management? Local banks are giving them citizenship, they're letting them invest in real estate, but is there more to do with them in regard to banking, maybe asset management again?
Definitely.
Definitely. I mean, there's a little bit of the chicken and the egg thing there, because you need that infrastructure to support bringing those kind of opportunities and funds, and therefore to get involved in proper asset management. And there's a lot of competition in that space. So you need infrastructure. Often you need to entice it with a tax regime that really does attract capital over to your shores. Most of the jurisdictions being featured today over the next 2 days have interesting tax regimes that really would make that appealing. In fact, I'm aware of visitors to the island as we speak that are here today exploring opportunities for investment, both on a business and on a personal level. But there's more that can be done there. And this is where we've seen other countries develop agencies who are there to leverage what has just come through our doors, so to speak. I mean, hundreds and thousands of investors over the last 20 years in this country. But even if you look over the last 5 years, there's a really interesting pool of candidates there who have the means and ought to be considering what the Caribbean has to offer in terms of investment. But tax plays a big role in that as well.
It does, tax and residency.
You guys do a lot of company registration in IBIS.
Yes, in the international financial services industry. Some people are creative. They combine citizenship with certain structures, the IBCs, LLCs, a trust, foundation, and they offer whole asset protection portfolio for clients, not just citizenship. And that may be the way to go. I keep saying that we need to look at what happens after citizenship and provide that value-added service to the clients, because people are looking for ways in which they can properly manage and save their assets. And with respect to the banks and the role that the banks play, I think they should be ready for this, because we do have quite a number of persons holding citizenship, and the minute we couple citizenship with residency, they'll want to do more. I think it's very important for us to look at it that way. And the question was asked earlier about whether the citizen who has citizenship by investment is equal to the citizen on the ground. And I would say the difference is residency. But the minute that citizen become a resident, things change. They want to now open a local company, maybe they want office space, they want some place to rent, they may have staff coming in, they may want to establish certain industries. Things would change with residency. And the banks would have to understand that these people want to invest, they want to move money, and they want to move it quickly, and they want to be able to manage that money. And so the banks should have a more open perspective and start to really look at managing risk as opposed to just de-risking and saying, oh, well, we don't want these clients. This, for the most part, it is legitimate business. And I don't think that is emphasized enough. For the most part, it is legitimate. I think each time we think of funds moving, we think, oh, it must be money laundering. But that is not necessarily the case. Don't start at the perspective, okay, this is money laundering. Let's get all of the due diligence in. Let's do proper, have a proper compliance and regulatory program in place. And once you have that, not only from onboarding, but continuing compliance stage, then you'll be better prepared to deal with what would come once these citizens become residents.
I mean, yeah, I have a very strong view about everything you just said, and I agree with it. I mean, there's, in our native land, Sam, there's been all this years of debate about the value and the benefit of these immigrant investors beyond their contribution that they make through these programs. The real contribution, the real upside is the ancillary benefits of them actually settling in a country and their consumption. I mean, I remember my Economics 101 class, you know, GDP equals C plus I plus G. C is consumption. I is investment. The CIP is the investment, is the I. G is government expenditure. Governments are broke. They have no money. There's no GDP growth out of government. But consumption in the United States is, some say, as high as 80% of what GDP drives is the consumer. Well, guess what? Who's been the winner of the immigrant investor program in Canada? Has it been Quebec or has it been Vancouver? Well, Quebec got most of the money, but Vancouver got the body, got the ancillary investments. Maybe not as many as others would have liked to have seen, but the point is the real upside. So anything that we could do here in the region to leverage these wonderful candidates who have gone through these programs to entice them to consider investing their assets for sure, but even spending some time.
Yes.
And becoming a resident and facilitating that. And, you know, it's a law of averages, but if you talk to 100 people, you could probably convince 2 or 3. Guess what? In this part of the world, that's a big upside. I would argue even more than their contribution. So that's where, you know, and I'm not sure, maybe it's not a CIU role, but the CIU has that information, has these clients. I call it an agency role. You know, you create an agency that really is out there to promote the region, its opportunities, its tax regimes, business environment, et cetera, et cetera. And anything you do to attract them to any big or small nation is really where the upside is.
Thank you. Well, one thing's for sure, the local governments ought to do more than just providing the citizenship. There has to be retention. There has to be asking them to do the banking here. They're creating actually to create a database to know who are your citizens abroad, and in case of a need and specific ties, you can call on them. So if you want to, I don't know, build something, you can call all the investors who are, or economic citizens who are involved in construction, and you can ask them to come. Well, we got 5 minutes left. We're gonna have a few questions. If you have something you need to clarify? No? What about a local digital currency, specific to this area? Do you think that's something we can foresee in the near future?
Listen, all great ideas, all different modes of payment. It's just another currency. The bottom line is, what's the source of the funds? What's the source of the wealth? That's what the regulators want to know. It's what the laws impose on jurisdictions, whether it's through a bank. And this is where the rub is with these cryptocurrencies. Is what's that regulatory regime that's going to regulate this? Because we want to stop the dissipation and transfer of the proceeds of crime. That's what all these rules are all about. So I think it's interesting. I think it's another mode of payment that could be, on an international scale, quite interesting in terms of getting things done swiftly. But it's not going to get away from the question of understanding where that money came from and who's transferring it and what their story is. We're not going to get away from that. Whether it's Bitcoin or dollars or euros or air miles, and what's a cryptocurrency? It's an air miles system. You have so many points, and you're just hoping that there's more and more people who want to exchange these air miles to buy things.
That's a nice way of looking at it. Jackie, your final word.
I agree. It's just another method, but at the end of the day, you have to make sure that the money is coming from a legitimate, clean source. We have seen Vanuatu just last year accepting cryptocurrency under its program, payment under its program. And we've seen other creative ways of dealing with some of the issues. I think I read somewhere Mexico introduced a payment system where there is biometric data and an IP system in place. And people are trying all sorts of stuff in order to make it safer for funds to move. But at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you have that strong compliance base and strong regulatory base, whereby you know for sure where the funds are coming from and that they're legitimate for the investment.
Well, thank you very much. That's it for this panel, and I hope you are going to enjoy the next one as much.
Thank you very much. That was most enlightening.